Hi, so thank you everyone, and I'd like to thank Dr. Borsheim for joining us today. Dr. Borsheim is a professor of pediatrics and geriatrics at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences, and she also directs the metabolism core at the Arkansas Children's Nutrition Center, and she's serving as interim co-director of the Arkansas Children's Nutrition Center. Dr. Borsheim is a friend, a mentor, an amazing scientist. She's one of my favorite collaborators, and she's well funded by the USDA and NIH. And today she's going to talk about some of her research that has recently made the rounds in the popular press related to fat and when you should maybe eat your meals. So do you want to go ahead and share your screen and get started, Elisabet?
Let's see if we can.
At the bottom down here.
Pardon?
You should be able to access it at the bottom.
See if I can do that.
Okay.
Can you see that now?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you here today. I will just talk a little bit about fat burning, or fat oxidation is also what it's called, in response to diet and exercise. And I really like this picture that they had added to the invitation for today, because that is exactly what we will talk about. Let's see if I can get it to move forward. So just quickly, a little reminder about the learning objectives. So we will define functions of fat for humans, define types of dietary fat, and I think you already talked about that a few weeks ago. We will look at the dietary guidelines, what they generally are for fat intake. And we will identify effects of exercise on fat metabolism or fat burning, and then talk a little bit about effects of meal timing on fat usage. So fat or lipids have many functions in the body and also functions in the food. So for us humans, it's really important to have adipose tissue as insulation to keep our core body temperature at within certain limits. And it's also mechanical protection for us. So if we fall, if kids fall, elderly fall, we fall, it is protection for us. And then lipids or fat has very high energy density, so it's a very effective way of storing energy in our bodies, both for energy need that we have between meals, but also for longer period of times. So we can manage to, without food for quite some time, just from the energy that we have stored in adipose tissue. And if we had to store that as glycogen, the form that carbohydrates are stored in the body, that would have been impossible. That would have made us into giants. So it's really an efficient way of storing energy. Then it's important for hormone production, immune function in our body, for regulation of various processes. Certain enzymes have components of lipids in them, and also for signaling. So all our nerves and all our cells have lipids in the cell membrane. So in order for all the cells, all the nerve cells and all the other cells to function properly, we need to have lipids. And there are certain lipids we need to get through the food. There are essential fatty acids that we need to get through the food and cannot produce in the body. But our body can also make fat from carbohydrates. So if we take in surplus of calories, the body will store this surplus of calories as fat. But again, there are certain fatty acids that we need to get through diet. So then also for the digestion and absorption of other nutrients, fat is important. And for certain vitamins, the fat-soluble vitamins, we need fat in order to absorb these from our diet. Fat is also very important when it comes to flavor in our food, as probably all of us have experience with. If we use more, say, a yogurt with higher fat content and lower fat content, usually the one that has higher fat content can be more flavorful. The same with, say, beef and other types of food. It's important also for the feeling of satiety. There are receptors in our GI tract, and so when there's fat, it signals satiety and releases hormones that are related to satiety feeling. So it's important, has important functions in that regard as well. And then I'll just go briefly through this because I know you already talked about this. But there are different types of fat in food. It's saturated fat, unsaturated fat, and trans fat. Saturated fat, it's related to how the molecules are, with the saturated fat then in general being solid at room temperature. So it's what we can find in butter, for example. Unsaturated fat, there are different types, monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats. And again, it comes down to the molecules that you may remember from chemistry and biochemistry and at school. So polyunsaturated fat, for example, olive oil, they're liquid at room temperature, and we can find these types of fat in avocados, walnuts, different types of nuts. And fatty fish has also these unsaturated, more healthy fats. Then there are trans fat. There are a little bit of trans fat naturally occurring, but most of these fats are produced in industry from more liquid fat. They are hydrogenated, or it's produced in industry to make these fat more lasting over time. And typically we can find these in hamburgers and fries and so on. And when it comes to the guidelines for fat, the guidelines, of course, is based on research, and it's recommended that we replace more of the saturated fat with healthier monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats, and that we totally avoid trans fat. It has been shown that saturated fat and trans fat intake is related to negative health consequences. Saturated fat, high intake of saturated fat is associated with a higher prevalence of cardiovascular problems, whereas the unsaturated fat and polyunsaturated fats can protect against cardiovascular diseases. So then, even though it's a very good way of storing calories, storing energy in the form of fat, if there's a surplus of calories, And we have a too high calorie intake relative to the calories that we are using in energy expenditure. We will store this as fat, and if we then reach higher amounts of adipose tissue in our body, our BMI, the body mass index, will rise to a level that is first defined as overweight. And then if we pack on even more fat, we can reach a BMI of 30. So that's the body weight divided by our height in meters squared. And if that's over 30, that's defined as obesity. And excess weight is linked to metabolic disturbances and poor health. So too much adipose tissue is linked to metabolic disturbances and poor health. And there's close association with hypertension, so elevated blood pressure, cardiovascular diseases, reduced sensitivity for insulin, and as it progresses, it can progress towards diabetes, type 2 diabetes. Also very common to see is that there is an excess amount of fat in the liver, and typically it's called fatty liver if the amount of fat in the liver is above 5%. There is an obesity epidemic in the Western countries now. In the US, approximately 19% of children and adolescents between 2 and 19 years, and about 40% of adults are presently defined as obese. And this has really just gone up over the last several decades now. And Arkansas, unfortunately, is on the top when it comes to the US states, when it comes to the prevalence of obesity. So we have work to do in that regard. So the way that we can lower the amount of adiposity in our body is to use more calories than we take in. So that can be done in two different ways. Either we take in less calories than we use, so it's on the intake side, or the usage or the burning of fat side. So that's the balance, and we can work on either side of the balance or on both sides of the balance. And when it comes to the calories that we use each day, most of these calories is just used to produce energy that we need in order to live. So it's called the resting metabolic rate. It's to keep the heart rate going, ventilation, all the different processes in the body. And that makes up for most of the daily energy expenditure. And then it also takes energy to digest and store the food that we take in, and that's called thermic effect of feeding. So that's the one on the bottom here. About 10% of our total daily energy expenditure. And then we have thermic effect of physical activity, and that's 15 to 30%. And we can really impact that one by being more active. It costs energy to move. And so when the muscles contract, they use energy to produce movement. And this may be a little bit complicated, but we'll walk through this. So during rest, if we look at this first column here, the blue part is fat burning. The yellow part is carbohydrate burning, so really sugar burning. And then the red part is protein that is being used to produce energy, produce ATP to the different processes in the body. And if we look at the you see they all make up 100%. And this just shows how much these different macronutrients contributes to our energy need at different level of exercise intensity. So the first column, if we're just during rest, most of our energy is actually covered from fat burning. And then carbohydrate also cover a large percentage, and protein just a small percentage. And you can see as we start to exercise and exercise harder and harder, protein part of the total energy remains pretty constant. And fat goes down some, and it goes down with intensity. And the second column here is very light intensity. The middle column is like moderate intensity exercise. And then the column to the right is high intensity exercise, so more towards the anaerobic, where we breathe really hard. When we use fat as energy, there's only a certain rate that we can produce ATP from fat. So when we get to the really high intensities, the fat burning can't really keep up with how fast we need ATP and how fast we need energy. Carbohydrates can produce ATP quickly and can also produce it without that we need oxygen, so it's anaerobic. So that's why more and more of the total is covered by carbohydrates when we get to the higher intensities. But even though fat contribution, say if we look at this 65% of the VO2 max, which is our peak fitness, like if we go 100% out, so 65%, so moderate intensity, even though fat contribute to less of the total, since we now are having a higher need of energy, the total amount of fat at 65% for say if we exercise 20 minutes at 65% of max versus 20 minutes of 25% of max, the total fat we are using over those 25 minutes is larger when we exercise at moderate intensity. So that was maybe confusing, and we can come back to it. But fat is an important, we use a lot of fat for energy, both when we exercise at low intensity and moderate intensity. And this is also maybe a little bit hard to see, but I just wanted to point out that we have free fatty acids that are circulating in our blood. And then we have triglyceride inside our muscles, so IMTG, and intramuscular triglycerides that are stored in the muscle and are also ready to be used. And this also differs a little bit depending on exercise intensity, how much we will use of the fat that is stored inside the muscle and how much is used of fatty acid that is circulating. So these fatty acids that are circulating, they are released from adipose tissue, sent out in circulation, and as we exercise, more and more is delivered and muscles take them up and use them for energy. Also, after exercise, we use more energy for a period of time. And this can be seen as an extra uptake in oxygen after exercise. And in this recovery period, there is a shift from carbohydrate to fat usage for energy. So if we have exercised just lightly, we may use an additional 25 kilojoules after exercise. If we have exercised more moderately, the energy, extra additional energy we use after exercise is a bit higher. And then on strenuous exercise, we really use quite a lot of additional kilocalories or kilojoules after exercise. If we then supply ourselves with carbohydrates either before exercise or immediately after exercise, this may then inhibit this fat usage, so we don't really get the benefits of using extra fat during and after exercise. So that's something to consider. Because the body's use of fat depends on the availability. So this is what I talked about, that we have fatty acids that are being delivered to the bloodstream, and the muscle takes them up and use them for energy. So when we eat fat, there is also then an extra availability of fatty acid in the bloodstream. And usually when this happens, the body adjusts the fat burning to take care of this additional availability. So we can see that after a meal with fat, we burn more fat as well. People with obesity have an impaired ability to adjust their metabolism and adjust the usage of this fat for energy. So then it's just circulating and it's being taken up and it's being stored in adipose tissue instead of being used for energy. Good news is that exercise is a very, very potent therapy and it has the ability to restore this metabolism. So if people with obesity exercise, we can see that they respond more appropriately to intake of fat as well. So both normal weight and obese people with obesity in various ways have a very beneficial effect of exercising. And it may be hard to get up to higher intensities, but there are lots of benefits also for lower intensity exercise. The last thing I wanted to mention, time is going so quickly, is that meal timing can affect how much we use fat as energy. And if we eat frequent meals, this can suppress our fat usage, and frequent snacks as well. So we never get into a period where our body is kind of fasting in between meals. And when we fast, that's when the machinery for fat usage is more turned up. But in our society today, there's constant delivery and usage of snacks, and we have frequent meals. So we really don't get into that state of fasting. And in a recent study we looked at early dinner versus late dinner. And this was young men and women that took part in 2 studies with approximately a week, if I remember correctly, in between. And we gave them fatty acid that was labeled in their food, in their dinner, and then we followed how this fatty acid was used for energy and oxidized, burnt during the night. And what we saw was that the same dinner, if they had this dinner late in the evening, they used less of this fat in the meal overnight, versus if they got an earlier dinner. And this was not just caused by that it was shifted in time. So in the second graph here, we adjusted the curves. So they all start at 0. So 0 being the dinner time. And you can see the red curve is really the usage of fat in the meal when it's taken in late, versus an earlier dinner. And you can see there was a significant lower usage of fat for energy in this particular study. And of course, then there was lots of tweeting about it, that late dinner will have you put on pounds and put on weight, but this was just an acute study, and there's lots of research that needs to be done to follow up on this. What would happen if the ones that eat dinner late exercise a little bit, a certain amount of time before dinner? Maybe that would have restored things back to, and lifted it up to where the blue line is. We don't know that. So there's more research that needs to be done. So that was in full speed, a little talk about fat usage for energy, and I think I will stop there. So we have time for a few questions.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Dr. Borsheim. I think I'm going to stop the recording because we just realized the other day that anything I record, including, screen captures and chats, gets posted on our YouTube channel. So I'm going to stop the recording and then we'll go forward with all the questions.